I call the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise to speak on the Appropriations Bills numbers 3 and 4, 2011-12. And I want to, in the time available to me, offer some observations in relation to this government's track record of budgetary discipline and management, which is a poor one, and sadly the poverty of its approach is all too clear in these appropriations bills, seeking, as they do, permission from the Parliament to spend more money than had originally been proposed in respect of the current financial year. I want to make 3 points in the brief time available to me. Firstly, that what the bills before the House demonstrate is that there has been a huge blowout halfway through the year in expenditure by this government. That is what we see from the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook. Secondly, that unfortunately that is simply the continuation of a trend which has characterised the approach of the Rudd-Gillard government to financial management. We have seen consistent lack of discipline, consistent poor approach to budgetary management, and what we are seeing in the bill before the House this afternoon is simply a continuation of that most unfortunate trend. And thirdly, against that backdrop, it really is extraordinary that Labor Party members of this House would think that there was some mileage to be gained in talking about what they persist in describing quite inaccurately as a $70 billion black hole. Let me turn to the point, firstly, that what we are seeing in the legislation which is before the House this afternoon is evidence of a very serious blowout in Australia's public finances in just the 6 or 7 months between the time that the 2011-12 budget was brought down and the time that the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook was published. In May 2012, we were told that the outcome that the government was budgeting for in the underlying cash balance would be a deficit of $22.6 billion. By December 2012, a mere 7 months later, we were now told that that deficit had blown out to the figure of $37.1 billion. In other words, almost $15 billion worse in a mere 7 months. Mr Deputy Speaker, what was put to the Parliament and to the people of Australia in the budget of 2011-12 was, by any standards of fiscal management, underwhelming and unimpressive. This government was proposing that the 2011-12 year would see spending of $362 billion, revenue a mere $342 billion, and, as I've mentioned, an underlying cash balance deficit of $22.6 billion. But a mere 7 months later, we learnt that things had got materially worse. Spending was going to increase from $362 billion to now $370 billion, and there would be softness on the revenue side, with revenue down from the originally proposed $342 billion to now $336 billion. How is it possible, Mr Deputy Speaker, to achieve such a remarkable deterioration in the fiscal position in such a short period of time? How can this be possible? What is it that has driven this very serious deterioration? Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, if you look through the budget papers, you see, sadly, evidence in area after area of profligacy, mismanagement and spending for clearly political objectives. For example, in the area of climate and energy efficiency, we learn that an extra $1 billion of spending has been agreed to just in the 6 or 7 months between the budget and the MyEFO. In the area of families, an extra $1.15 billion, essentially as part of the taxation and compensation package linked with the carbon tax. Indeed, it forms part of what we are told is a $14.3 billion package to help households meet increased costs under the carbon tax. That's how it's described by this government, Mr Deputy Speaker. But seasoned observers of this government know well that you are naive in the extreme to take this government's explanations at face value. Because what we really have under the carbon tax arrangements, what we really have reflected in the budget deterioration, which is documented in the legislation before the House this afternoon, is the use of the carbon tax package as a disguised means of offering benefits to particular groups of stakeholders in the community. This is a deeply political package which has been specifically targeted to particular groups as a means of furthering the Labor Party's political objectives. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, remarkably enough, the figures which are contained in the budget, the figures which go to make up the underlying cash balance, do not tell the full sorry story of the financial deterioration which is occurring under this government. Because the Rudd-Gillard government has been an enthusiastic user of accounting tricks designed to keep expenditure out of the headline number, generally referred to as the budget deficit, that's to say the underlying cash balance, and they have done that through a range of approaches which are designed to make the underlying cash balance smaller than it otherwise would be. For example, if you look at the treatment in the 2011-12 budget paper number 2 of the $108 million Renewable Energy Venture Capital Fund, which we are told will support the development and commercialisation of renewable energy technologies by making early-stage equity investments, that $108.7 million was included in the budget bottom line and in the forward estimates. That is the appropriate accounting treatment. Expenditure to be incurred is included in the underlying cash balance. However, when we turn to the much larger $10 billion Clean Energy Finance Corporation, that number is not included in the main in the budget bottom line. It is not included in the forward estimates. And the rationale that was given for that treatment by Finance Minister Senator Wong in speaking to Senate estimates some months ago was that this is not necessary because the Clean Energy Finance Corporation is, quotes, undertaking investments to make a return, close quotes. The fiction inherent in that is obvious from the fact that the Renewable Energy Venture Capital Fund, which I've just described, is included in the underlying cash balance, is included in the budget bottom line, yet the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which does just about exactly the same thing as the Renewable Energy Venture Capital Fund, is not included in the budget bottom line because the government has taken a highly optimistic and, on any objective view, a heroic interpretation of the accounting standards to reach the conclusion that the bulk of this $10 billion does not need to be included in the underlying cash balance. Mr Deputy Speaker, the reality is this: whether those numbers are included in the underlying cash balance or not, it is money that will be spent by this government. It is money that needs to be borrowed. It is money that will have to be repaid by Australian taxpayers. And this is not a one-off, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is not the only time this government has used this accounting trick. Far from it. The National Broadband Network comprises $18.2 billion of spending over the 4 years through to 2014-15. None of that is included in the underlying cash balance, again on the fiction that this is an investment and in some way we are going to get a return. I say this to any taxpayer who is patiently awaiting a return of his or her money which is being thrown into this yawning, gaping chasm of waste. Don't be too optimistic. Don't spend much time thinking what you're going to do with the return on that investment, because you will almost certainly never see any of that money again. So far, NBN Co has racked up accumulated losses of $400 million, and yet this completely unsuccessful venture is the basis, or is the subject of spending of $18.2 billion, and this government has the hide to claim that this is an investment and therefore the money does not need to be included in the underlying cash balance. And the range of areas where this accounting technique has been used goes on and on. When it comes to rail track, for example, $1.2 billion has been invested in rail track on the same basis. In fact, when you add up the three ventures that I've talked about, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the National Broadband Network and rail track, over the next 6 years, beginning in 2011-12, the federal government, the Gillard government, is planning to spend over $5 billion a year, which is not included in the budget bottom line. So I've spoken about the blowout that we have seen in expenditure by this government, and I've made the point that the true situation is even worse than the figures which are put before the Parliament and put before the people of Australia in the underlying cash balance, because there is an additional amount exceeding $5 billion a year being spent using heroic accounting treatment, which assumes the money is an investment because there's going to be some kind of return. Anybody who expects a return is frankly naive. Let me turn to the second point I want to make in the time that I have available. The deterioration we are seeing in the middle of this year is consistent with the hopeless and ongoing deterioration in Australia's fiscal position that has characterised every step taken by the Rudd-Gillard government. We hear frequently that there was a global financial crisis and that excuses all spending. Now, there is nothing that a Labor government enjoys more than a rolled gold excuse to turn on the spending taps. There is nothing they like more than being able to say, oh well, we were going to be fiscal conservatives. Kevin Rudd did talk briefly about being a fiscal conservative, but circumstances have changed, so let's rub our hands together with glee. It's spend, spend, spend. But Mr Deputy Speaker, even if we were to take at face value, just for a moment, this government's claim that unusual spending was required to respond to the global financial crisis, it does not explain why spending rose in the 2008-9 year to $316 billion, up from $272 billion the previous year. That is to say, well over $40 billion in increase. It does not explain why that increase, justified, we are told, as a response to the global financial crisis and as a requirement to stimulate demand, it does not explain why, having reached that new baseline, when we got to the next year, we did not return spending back to normal levels. And of course we did not. What happened under this government was that spending just exploded, and the so-called peak requirement to meet the global financial crisis became, I'm sorry to say, under this government, the new normal. And $316 billion became $337 billion, became $349 billion, became $362 billion, became $372 billion. Spend, spend, spend. This government has the hide, Mr Deputy Speaker, I say in making my third point, to claim that the opposition is in some way in fiscal trouble because of this alleged $70 billion black hole. Let me contrast that to Labor's proven record of black holes year after year: $27 billion deficit, $55 billion deficit, $48 billion deficit, $37 billion deficit. This government is not in a black hole, they're in a black universe, and they're not coming out. They just love spending. And there is a massive difference between this government's proven track record of fiscal failure and what we see on the part of the opposition, which is a forward-looking policy process in which you identify possible gaps and then set about doing something to correct them. And that is the fundamental difference between our approach to fiscal policy and Labor's approach to fiscal policy, that when we see gaps, we set about trying to correct them. And if you doubt that, look at the proud record of the Howard and Costello government over more than a decade, surplus after surplus after surplus, and the only way we'll get back to surplus is to get back to a coalition government.